A cartouche was an oval frame which surrounded the name of an Egyptian god or royalty, such as a pharaoh. It also acted as an amulet, protecting the person against evil spirits both in the present life and in the next. A representation of a rope encircled the cartouche, protecting the person whose name was written inside. So we're ready to make our cartouche. So these are the things you're going to need from your craft kit. You're going to need a plastic knife. You're going to need a small paintbrush. We're going to use this end as a tool to make our cartouche. You're going to need some squares of white tissue paper, and you're going to need to cut out the template that you'll have in your craft kit as well. You'll also find in your craft kit a chart showing all the letters of the hieroglyphic alphabet and the sounds that they make. Some things you're going to need from home is a small or medium-sized bowl so that we can mix our salt dough mix. You're going to need a 1/4 cup of water. You're going to need 2 or 3 colors of just crafter's acrylic. You can get this at your local dollar store. You're going to need a paintbrush and you're going to need a pencil. So let's get started. We're going to take our salt dough mix and we are going to add to that, we're going to add, a 1/4 cup of water. And I'm just going to mix that with my fingers. I'm going to incorporate all the dry with the wet until it all comes into a ball. Okay, so I'm going to turn everything out onto the parchment paper and I'm going to continue working the salt dough until it all comes together. And we want this to be nice and smooth and elastic. So what I'm going to do is continue kneading this dough with my hands until it's soft and pliable and easy to work with. It should feel a lot like Play-Doh when you've got the right consistency. Okay, that looks really good. We're ready to roll this out. Now you can use your hand to flatten this dough out, or you can even use something to roll it out with. You could even use one of these bottles of crafter's acrylic just to roll it out. The main thing is that you want to make sure that that dough is about 1/4 inch thick and you don't have any spots that are too thin or too thick, because we want this cartouche to dry out evenly in the oven. So I'm just going to flatten out a little bit and then I'm going to use my bottle here as a rolling pin. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to take that template that I cut out earlier and I'm going to place it right on top. And it fits quite nicely. Next, we're going to take our plastic knife and we're just going to cut right around that template. We're going to remove all the extra bits. Okay, now we've got a really nice shaped template. And what we're going to do with these extra little bits is we're going to roll this out into a long rope. And this is the magical rope that has powers to protect the person whose name is inside the cartouche. So I'm just going to continue rolling this out until we get a nice long rope. You want to make sure that this rope is not too thick on one end and not too thin on the other. We want it to be as uniform as we can get it. Let's try it out. Oops, it's still a little bit on the short side, so we are going to continue rolling that rope out until we get the desired length. There we go. Now that's just the perfect length. And I'm just going to pinch those parts together so they stay. And we want to push that into our cartouche. There we go. Just like that. There we go. So now we need to get some hieroglyphs put on this cartouche. So hieroglyphics is based on sounds. They're based on phonetics. So if my name has 5 letters in it, like I will show you here, this is how we spell my name, D-E-E-P-A. But there's actually 4 sounds in there. First we hear the D, then there's the long E sound, then there's the P, and then finally there's the long A sound. So your job is to try to figure out the sounds of your name. And then with this chart, you're going to find all those letters, okay? And then we'll take those squares of tissue, and for example, there is a letter D sound in my name. So we're just gonna find the letter D, and we're gonna place a square of tissue, and I'm just gonna trace over that outline. You don't have to get all the details if you can't, as long as you get the outside shape. And I'm gonna continue that for all of the sounds of my name. And this chart that you'll have in your craft kit will not only give you the sounds of all of those letters, it'll give you the symbol, because that's exactly what hieroglyphics is. They're symbols that represent sounds. Okay, now that I have my 4 hieroglyphs, I'm going to arrange them. So I have here the D sound. I have the long E sound. I have the P sound. And I also have the long A sound. Now, with hieroglyphics, you can arrange it from top to bottom, or you can arrange it from left to right, whatever style you choose, whatever orientation you choose. Now we're going to take our tool and we're going to just poke holes right in those outlines. Just like that. When we lift it, we'll have a little outline just like that. Like I said, if you can't get all the details in there, don't worry about it, as long as you have the general shape of the hieroglyph. Now what we're going to do with the tool is we're going to basically just connect the dots. And you probably will have to refer to your hieroglyphs chart so you can see what those hieroglyphs are supposed to look like. Okay. Now we've brushed away any bits of dough that are in the way. And I'm pretty happy with the way that that looks. Everything is coming together. My hieroglyphs are inside. I've got all of the characters in my name. That looks great. Okay, now all we need to do is transfer that parchment paper right onto a baking sheet. And you're going to bake or dry out this cartouche in your oven at 250 degrees for 2 hours. Halfway through, so 1 hour into the drying process, you're going to turn that cartouche right over so that the other side dries. Make sure that you get the help of a grown-up when you're using the oven. Great, so now we have those 4 hieroglyphs that make up the sound of my name. I'm going to place my D right at the top. Now hieroglyphs was usually in a vertical configuration, so from top to bottom. You can also go from left to right. I'm going to put the long E sound. I'm going to put my P sound there, and then finally my long A. So if you're happy where that's placed, you can take your little tool. It's actually a paintbrush, but we're going to take this closed end, and we're just going to poke holes right through the tissue on the outline of those hieroglyphs or those picture symbols. So there's the first one. So I'm going to take the same end of that tool and I'm going to just connect all of those, just like connect the dots. You don't want to press too hard because we don't want to go through the dough. But if you do go through the dough, it's okay. You can just roll up the dough and start all over again. So I'm going to take out any extra pieces like that. I like how that looks. I'm going to add the next one right underneath in a column. So I'm going to start by poking holes. And we're going to remove that. It gives us a little bit of an outline to go by. If you're having a hard time seeing the shape, you can always refer to your chart here just to look and see what those hieroglyphs are supposed to look like. There's the P sound in my name. And then finally, we have the long A. Okay, so if you have any little bits of dough that are floating around, you can just brush those off. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how my cartouche looks. Now I'm ready to dry my cartouche out in an oven. So you want to put this cartouche on a baking sheet in your oven at 250 degrees for 2 hours. Halfway through, so an hour into the baking, you're going to turn it over and dry it out for another hour at 250. So kids, just make sure that you get the help of a grown-up to do this. Okay, so our cartouche has been dried in the oven, and I've let my cartouche dry completely. This could take up to 2 hours, or you could speed up the process and just put it in your fridge for a half an hour to an hour. We just want to make sure that it's cool before we apply our paint. So in your craft kit, you'll have a little tub of gold Crafters acrylic paint, and you're going to use a paintbrush that you've got around home, and we're just going to start applying that first coat of paint. You can put it on quite liberally. You want to make sure that we cover all of the salt dough. Now you can see that my cartouche has been covered with one coat of paint, but it doesn't look really solid to me. So I think I'm going to add one more coat of paint. Before you add the second coat of paint, wait 15 minutes for the first coat to dry before applying. Okay, so we have finished painting the second coat on our cartouche, and it looks nice and solid. It looks like a solid piece of gold. And you can see that the hieroglyphs for my name have been inscribed in the salt dough, and I can already feel the magical powers of this cartouche working. The Scarab Secret by Nick Wood and published by Francis Lincoln Publishing. The Pharaoh's painters have just finished decorating his new temple. Most of all, I like the stars. Aren't they beautiful? By special request of the Pharaoh, I have been painted too. There, on the far wall, just below the man with the head of a jackal. That's me, Khepri, the scarab beetle. And this is the tale of how I came to be honored. Every morning I would set off from the shelter of the temple walls down to the great river, looking for food and soaking up warmth. When the sun was high, I sheltered among the roots of a tree under a stone. But one morning was different. I looked up, and there in front of the temple stood a young man dressed in the robes of a prince. He stopped, bent, and scooped me up in the palm of his hand. I was not afraid. A peacefulness filled me. "So," he said softly, "the rising sun shines down on me, and yet I hold the sun in my hand. For Khepri, your name means rising sun. You are well named and well found." Then he gently put me back on the ground and whispered, "We shall meet again, you and I." That night I chose a new resting place. In the evening, down where all the boats come and go, I crawled inside a basket of dried figs. It was cozy and dark. I slept. When I woke, the basket was swaying, and I heard the chatter of voices. Where was I going? Cold surrounded me. We were going down steps. With a jolt, the basket was dropped on a hard stone floor. I could hear ringing hammers and chisels. Men were singing. I crawled out and scuttled into the shadow of the wall. When I turned back, the basket had gone. The men had all disappeared. I was alone. I was frightened. Perhaps there was another way out. Keeping to the shadow of the wall, I crawled along and soon came to a fork. I took the left-hand passage. The air felt colder. The light from the torches dimmed. Suddenly, I stopped. I sensed danger. Very, very slowly, I took a step forward, and then I felt it. A crack in the smooth floor, so fine even I could hardly see it. It ran from one wall across to the other. Why was it there? I jumped across it, and as I landed, I knew why. The stone slab beneath me gave way, sank down, and then rose back up. It was perfectly balanced, like a feather on a knife edge. If the mere weight of a tiny beetle could make it sink, then... I shuddered. A man walking along this passage would fall straight through to certain death. I leapt back to the safety of the solid stone floor and scuttled as fast as I could back to the stairwell. There were footsteps on the stairs. I turned, and there stood my prince. In the torchlight, his eyes sparkled. 3 men dressed in white and yellow with swords at their waists were with him. I hid in a corner as the men went from chamber to chamber. The prince was inspecting the work. While he visited the largest room, I waited in the passage that led to the fork. The 4 men approached. "This way, Your Highness," said one, and pointed down the left-hand fork. I wanted to cry out, "No!" If the prince went down there, he would die. Surely the men knew that. And then I realized, of course they knew. That was why the tomb was empty. There were to be no witnesses to the prince's death, apart from a lowly beetle, me. The prince stopped, eyed each man in turn, and then asked in a clear voice, "You are sure this is the passage?" "Yes, Your Majesty." The prince stood still, and slowly his gaze fell downward. I moved forward into the light. A faint smile flickered across his face. "Khepri, we meet again." The men glanced nervously at each other as he knelt and scooped me up. "The great god Ra created all things," declared the prince. "This beetle is as precious to Ra as the Pharaoh himself. Ra has placed him here for a reason." "What reason could that be?" asked one of the men anxiously. "To guide me in my hour of need," replied the prince. "Let us place the beetle at the parting of the ways. Whichever fork he takes, I will follow." The prince put me down. Slowly but surely, I moved towards the right-hand fork. "Look, Khepri has chosen for me, and I shall follow his lead," said the Pharaoh. "But before I do, I would like you 3 to lead me down the other passage." The men froze. Then they shouted and began to run away. The prince didn't move. He knew that the royal guards were waiting for them outside. He bent down and gently picked me up. "As Ra decreed, we meet again," he whispered. "This tomb is no place for you, Khepri. Come, I shall take you back across the river to the temple where you and I belong." Now the stars of Egypt burn above me once more. The night is warm and my tale is told. A tale that shows that even a humble beetle can play its part in the life of a great prince.
Hi kids. Our ancient Egyptian adventure has come to an end, but that doesn't mean you should stop learning about this great civilization. Be sure to check out the library's Pinterest page for more fun activities about ancient Egypt, and don't forget to look at the books and DVDs available from the library on this subject. I hope you've enjoyed our journey back in time and had a chance to pick up a few souvenirs along the way. Thanks for joining me on this adventure, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your spring break.